Hello everyone, Jason from Truth Behind the Magic here, back at you with another video. This one I spent a couple hours on yesterday coming up with notes for, because I was really coming up with a lot of stuff to put in this and excited about making this video, and really what spurred this was a couple things. The first is that I, of course, if you've watched the channel for a while, know that I did a few college programs. I worked in the parks and resorts across a few different roles, so just from my experience, I know that there's differences between the two and stuff that I've noticed, stuff that I've picked up from talking to roommates and just other participants, and just stuff that I've observed from other people over the years. And the second thing is that unless they changed it from 2023 to now, which I doubt, the last program that I did, you were allowed to indicate whether you preferred park or resort as far as where you would get your job placement. Now, that preference really only comes down to whether or not they can accommodate it. So really prepare for both, obviously. But I would assume they do try to honor that if they can. And kind of the first thing I'll dig right into here is just talking about the differences between roles as far as the parks and resorts. Some of it's obvious, maybe some of it is not quite as obvious. The majority of popular roles, and by that I mean roles that a lot of people get placed in, have a lot of overlap between the two. Quick service, merchandise, custodial, those are roles that have a presence in both locations. As far as parks and resorts, you can definitely get placed in either. There are some differences, which I'll get into here in a minute, especially in quick service, because that's what I did, so that's what I can talk the most about, but some of that pertains to other roles as well. As far as park-specific roles, you have attractions. Now, it is possible that there are a couple other places on property where they are technically attractions cast members. I know the Skyliner originally were attractions cast members. Now I think it's designated as its own thing. I don't know if that's changed. PhotoPass is another that is just in the parks, which once again, there may occasionally be a PhotoPass spot at Disney Springs, or maybe there's a permanent one there. I'm honestly not sure. I wouldn't be surprised. Entertainment is almost exclusively in the parks, as far as being a character performer, character attendant, that kind of thing, but it does have a little bit of overlap to the resorts as well. Resort specific, of course, anything having to do with hotel operations, such as Bell Services, which is what I did a program in, front desk / concierge, housekeeping, any of that is, of course, resort specific. Recreation / child's activities, those are also resort specific, which once again, there could possibly be a few children's activities cast members in the parks. I'm honestly not sure. And there can be some big differences between these same roles depending on where you get placed. Like I mentioned a minute ago, quick service, custodial, and merchandise have a lot of cast members in both categories, but it of course tends to be slower at the resorts compared to the parks in terms of pace. Now, I worked at Riverside, the Mill, as they call it, in quick service, and that's generally a faster-paced location, and that's something I'm going to get into pretty deep here in a minute, is the resorts, and as far as how fast-paced I believe the positions would be there. But Riverside has about 2,000 rooms, plus you get some overlap from French Quarter guests coming to that food court and vice versa. So Riverside, the food court there is still pretty serious. I'm not going to say it's as serious as working at Cosmic Rays or Pecos Bill in terms of pace, but it's still pretty fast-paced at certain times. And pretty much any location will be like that, but when you're working at somewhere like Riverside that has 2,000 rooms, you still have a pretty big customer base, which some of the resorts don't have nearly that big of a base. French Quarter, on the other hand, which I was deployed to, as they call it, for a couple months on my first program, was pretty much the exact opposite. It only has about half as many rooms as Riverside, which is still a decent amount. 1,000 rooms is still fairly large by Disney standards, but it was much slower paced. Despite having the beignets right there and some overlap from guests from Riverside coming there, it was just a lot slower than Riverside because it's significantly smaller. Something to keep in mind with quick service specifically is that the overall business of the food court, first of all, varies heavily based on room count, like I was just saying, but also the tier of the resort plays a big role in that, as far as value, moderate, deluxe. And there are kind of some exceptions, but generally, at value resorts, you are effectively the only dining option if you're working quick service there. And you get resorts with very high room counts like Pop Century, which is the highest at all of Disney World with roughly 2,800 rooms. Art of Animation has about 2,000 rooms. And those resorts have very well-renowned food courts, I would say. The All-Star resorts, people like the food courts there. You're gonna see a lot of guests, because like I said, you are essentially you're the only food option there other than vending machines, effectively. And same with merchandise. I would say this kind of spills out across a lot of the roles, but you're gonna see a faster pace if you're at a larger resort. Now, if you're at like Contemporary, Poly, you're gonna get more guests because you're in the Magic Kingdom area and people can obviously resort hop there very easily, and those are very popular resorts. But just in general, it goes down as you go up the tiers. At moderate resorts, you will still very much be a focus of the guests because generally the moderate resorts maybe have one sit-down restaurant. Riverside had Boat Riots, which is literally connected to the kitchen of the food court. And that was the only sit-down for both the Port Orleans resorts. But we still got a lot of guests there, as I was saying earlier. But those table service restaurants will alleviate some of that pressure from your location. And you can get placed at those table service restaurants, too. You can be a seater, is another position, which I'm sure, once again, there's some differences between parks and resorts when it comes to that position as well. Probably not as pronounced as quick service, but some. And Coronado Springs is one that I wanted to talk about specifically when it comes to moderate resorts, because this kind of spills over to a lot of the roles there, but Coronado's interesting because you have quite a few restaurants there. You have the Maya Grill, Three Bridges, Toledo at the top of the tower. And you have the factor of it being a major convention resort with big events taking place there, which is what affects a lot of the other roles. And it's also just a ridiculously big resort. It's the biggest in terms of actual area, but it's the second largest in terms of room count at about 2,400. So the food court tends to stay pretty busy there from what I could tell. I didn't work there in quick service, I was in Bell Services. But that food court is massive. It's in a huge building, and it stays busy because those conventions especially. So that's kind of going to be an outlier. I would imagine Coronado is as busy as the value resorts for sure, if not busier, when there's a convention going on. At least for quick service and probably merchandise as well. Now, when you get to the deluxe resorts, quick service restaurants take a back seat to table service. You will definitely still have busy periods, morning time before the parks open, after park close. Those are the busy times in resort quick service. In park quick service, I'm sure it's different. I'm sure right after opening is very busy for breakfast. I know that from people that I've talked to. Of course, regular lunch and dinner time. At the resorts, it's kind of like that as well, but it's different because everyone's in the parks. But for deluxe resorts, for example, you have Animal Kingdom Lodge, which has Boma, Jiko, both at the Jumbo House right next to each other, and you have Sanaa at Kidani Village, all of which are very highly regarded and popular restaurants. But you also have the Mara Food Court, which is still very high regarded in terms of deluxe food courts. I think it might be the only actual food court at a deluxe resort, and I've eaten there. It's definitely one of the best quick service places on property. Captain Cook's at the Polynesian is another kind of outlier because that is quick service, but it stays pretty busy there at the Polynesian. And role duties can vary between the parks and resorts as well. Like I said, a lot of this is focused on quick service, which I'm trying to not just only stay stuck on that, but a lot of my examples are from that. But for example, when I was working at Riverside, we had a small market area there in the food court where you could buy like single food items, and we had the resort refillable mugs. So that was essentially an aspect of merchandise that we had to perform in our job duties, which is not something you will really see at park locations. There may be some park quick service locations that are kind of like that, but a lot of the times at the parks, it's just really too busy for you to be doing something like that, so they just focus you on your real job duties. Moving on to the next big category here, and that's transportation. This is another pretty major thing that differs between the two. It generally takes longer to travel from housing to your work location if you're working in the parks. This can, of course, vary heavily depending on the park where you were working and your work location, which I will get into here in a minute. And kind of a side note on this, the bus routes, as far as I can tell, have seen a significant improvement from the pre to post-COVID world. Watch my recent bus video where I talked about that a lot, if you would like to do so. So your bus ride may be shorter to a park than it used to be. There's only 2 housing complexes. I mean, it's technically one big complex, but 2 stops that they stop at now. They're right next to each other. It's not like the old days where you had Vista Way and then you had 2 or 3 miles away the rest of the housing complexes, so you had to stop at least 3 times before you even started making the stops to let cast members off at their work locations. But many of the things that make getting into the parks a bit more difficult are still a thing that exists today for both bus and car users on the program. First of all, the parking lots are typically much bigger at the parks. You will learn that if you were working there and have to park in the back. And the bus stops are a lot further away from work locations because obviously they have to let you off at one location for everyone who works there. So the cast member, the college program bus stop is going to be further away from where you would work at the parks as opposed to the resorts. The process of simply getting into the parks is more rigorous than the resorts. You may have to walk a pretty decent distance from your parking spot or bus stop to the cast member entrance, or just the cast services building as it typically is at most of the parks, or at least 2 or 3 of them. That's where you enter. You have to go through security. Not really like a screening or anything, but you have to have your ID to get in there and everything. It's not quite the same as the resorts, which are a little bit more laid back in terms of that. And the first thing that comes to mind here is the Animal Kingdom bus stop for the college program. It's pretty far away from the park entrance. And that's just because I think in general the cast member parking lot there is kind of disconnected from the park. So that's kind of an interesting one as far as how far you might have to walk. I don't know if they have a bus that runs from there to where you enter the park as a cast member. I'm the least familiar with Animal Kingdom, I will tell you that right now. I've been backstage at all 3 other parks. I've been at their cast services area. been at costuming, but Animal Kingdom, I'm pretty out of the water when it comes to that, because I do know where the bus stop is, of course. I know that it's far away, but I just haven't known a lot of people who worked there and had a lot of discussion with them. I don't know if the cast members there enter through the front of the park. I've seen a lot of people who look like they're entering there, but it also looks like there may be a back entrance, so it's probably either or. But either way, it's going to be a good walk there. It is not right next to the entrance, and the cast services building there is not next to the park, so that's kind of another thing. The cast services and costuming is its own separate location there. And this is all taken to another level at Magic Kingdom, because forget walking there, that's the least of your issues. You have to park at a place called West Clock, which is behind the Magic Kingdom, and none of this is like company secret type stuff. You can drive by there, it's a public road. And you have to take a bus from there to the Utilidors, the famous Utilidors. The entrance of those, I should say. You don't drive the bus down in there. So that adds a good bit of travel time, both to and from work. I would say that's one of the trade-offs of Magic Kingdom. You get to work at the most legendary location on Disney property, but it's a little more difficult to get in there. Epcot can be a similar scenario where you may need to take a bus. They have a bus behind the World Showcase for cast members, although that'll probably only really factor in if you're an international programmer. Epcot used to have significant parking struggles. They had a tiny parking lot comparatively to the other parks. Like, it's not a small parking lot, but compared to the other areas, it was very small. Sometimes you couldn't find the spot. But they recently opened a new lot that's adjacent to the guest parking lot for cast members, and I would imagine you may have to take a bus from there to the cast member entrance to the park. I'm not sure where you go in. If you park there, I'm sure it's different than parking in the other lot that is right behind Epcot, or beside, really. But going to Hollywood Studios, it is the simplest of all, and that was one of the things that made me very happy when I found out that's where I would be working attractions. You simply park in the cast lot, which is adjacent to the guest parking, and you walk in through cast services, past costuming, and you're backstage. No buses, nothing like that, which is a big benefit of Hollywood Studios. Now, that's just the first part of your journey to work. Instead of Journey into Imagination, they should have Journey into Your Workplace. That should be the replacement for that. Once you have made it backstage, you still may have a significant walking distance from there to your location. You may be fortunate enough to have a location that is right next to the entrance. I mean, it's possible that you could literally get it where you go backstage and then walk down a hallway, open a door, or not, probably wouldn't be a hallway, an alleyway, open a door, and you're at your location. It's possible to get that. But for a lot of people, you may have to have a fairly long walk across both backstage and onstage areas to your location. Toy Story Mania, which was where I worked, it was not one of the closest locations to the entrance at Hollywood Studios, but was also not one of the furthest. And it still took a good while for me to walk from the parking lot to my location. Over the course of my program, I think I estimated that it was about 7 minutes typically. And that would be walking pretty fast, because I was usually pretty close to cutting it where I would be late. But, for example, if you were at Tower of Terror, Rock and Roller Coaster, it would be longer than that. I mean, it has to be 10 plus minutes, for sure. The closest area at Hollywood Studios to the cast member entrance is the Muppet Courtyard and the Star Tours area. And then, of course, the farthest away is Tower of Terror. At Epcot, Test Track, Mexico, and World Discovery are the closest to the cast member entrance. Now, they also have a Utilidor system there, so I'm sure that helps if you have to go across. It looks like the land and some of the parts of the world showcase at the top are the furthest away from the entrance. In Magic Kingdom, Fantasyland is the closest to where you get off the West Clock bus in the Utilidors. And Space Mountain looks like it's the furthest. Splash Mountain / Big Thunder and Main Street. Those are kind of the two areas that look like they would be the furthest walk for you. And once again, I'm not very familiar with Animal Kingdom and where you actually enter the park as a cast member, but it looks like Pandora is the closest, if there's a cast member entrance there. Or potentially it's the Oasis / Tree of Life area, the main entrance, if that's where you were going in. And Asia would be the furthest away in terms of walking distance. Now, getting to the resorts and walking distance, well, just distance in general, the time that it takes you to get to work at a resort is mostly based off of how far it is from housing. That is the prime thing. Because, like, if for Magic Kingdom, for example, going back to the parks, I would have to ask Blaze. If you've seen the channel for a while, you know he's my co-host on here. Hopefully he'll be back on the show soon. He worked at Magic Kingdom. I would have to ask him if it actually took longer once you got off the college program bus to get into the park and to your work location. I would wager it probably does. Maybe not if you're taking the college program bus, but if you're driving, I would say almost certainly it's going to take you longer once you get out of your car to get to your location. But at the resorts, you're going to be in your car for most of your commute there. You're not going to be walking. Most roles at the resorts are centered around what I would call the main hub of the lobby, the main lobby building, and kind of the adjacent buildings. And that's usually where the buses will drop you off, the college program buses. Now, Coronado Springs is an exception. I became Sean Connery. Because cast services is very far away from Grand Destino Tower, because that was, of course, a later addition to the resort. But now that's like the hub area. And I saw where the college program bus stop was, and I was like, sheesh, you have a pretty good walk from there. I would wager probably 5+ minutes. Well, maybe not that bad, but it's a lot more than where I had to go from as someone who had a car. There were 2 lots for cast members there, but one of them was in front of the Grand Destino Tower on the left, one was kind of to the right if you were looking at it. But those were both pretty close, a 1 to 2 minute walk, which is pretty far for a resort, to be honest. Usually I'd say it's probably 30 seconds to get into the building as a cast member, but, well, maybe not that low, but 2 minutes at least is pretty long, actually. That's usually how long it took me, like I said, 1 to 2 minutes to get from the parking lot to where I clocked in for Bell services. Riviera also has a weird college program bus stop, if it is where I think it is, because I would often see people sitting there when I was delivering luggage. It's pretty far from the main building, and you kind of just are behind it. It's probably kind of confusing figuring out how to get to some of the work locations on your first day, but that's any place at Disney, to be fair. But in most cases, you'll be very close to the main lobby if you take the bus or park at a resort. Riverside literally lets off at like the guest bus stop now. Their college program buses do. It used to be different. It used to be behind the food court. But it's probably a 20-second walk from there to the entrance of the resort. Moving on to training. Training tends to be essentially the same at the 2 locations. Not 2 locations, but 2 categories. You'll have an orientation day, which does differ between the 2, because at the parks, you're taking a tour of the park, which at Hollywood Studios, we didn't go into Toy Story Land or Galaxy's Edge, which was kind of funny because obviously I was working at Toy Story Land, but for people who had never seen either anything of Disney before, it's kind of lame to not get to see your location on the orientation day, but I digress. At the resorts, you take a tour of your resort, but the thing about the resorts is some of them are pretty sprawling. Not to say the parks aren't, but things can be more spread out. And when I worked at Riverside, we were touring both of the resorts. It was an orientation for both. So we were in a van and hopped around some of the different locations there. And it'll be like that probably at some of the resorts. You may be in a van or golf carts or something similar to that on your orientation day. And another difference is that the parks generally have a lot more safety critical roles. So your training may be a little bit more rigorous there. I know for me, I had to pass essentially an exam on the operating guide at Toy Story Mania, which they give you 3 chances to take it. So, and it tells you what you got wrong. I passed it on the first try, but you do get 3 chances there. And it's pretty serious when you take the actual on-the-job assessment as well. Well, I shouldn't say pretty serious. They're forgiving on some stuff. I actually had a mistake in mind that they still let me pass with. Pretty big mistake. But it is a little bit more rigorous when you're in a safety-critical role, which the parks have a lot of those. Big thing here, which is going to be the third or fourth category I've talked about here, and probably the biggest difference is going to be the difference in hours that you will work between the 2 categories. College programmers at the resorts tend to start earlier than the parks, and they finish work later than people at the parks. That is definitely one of the big advantages of the parks over the resorts. Quick service restaurants at the resorts typically open at 6 or 7 a.m., pretty early. Custodial and other roles probably also need to be there that early, maybe even earlier, although they do have overnight people that are not college program. And the quick service restaurants don't close till 11 p.m. or even midnight at the resorts. Bell services and front desk are very similar. When I was in Bell services, shifts could be as early as 7 a.m., or maybe even 6 a.m., although those were always taken by full or part-timers. You pretty much never saw that as a college programmer. And our 2 closing positions there left at midnight and 12:15 a.m. respectively. So if you're at a resort, be ready to have an interesting sleep schedule. Typically, they will either have you working mornings or the late evenings. They won't do the split shift stuff. They can't, in a sense. You have to have 8 hours between the 2, which is still not enough. But generally, you won't just be popping around every day as some other morning or night shift. Now, afternoon shifts, you will get like afternoon, evening, morning. Like if you're working mornings, you'll see an afternoon, like a 12 start time every once in a while or something. Those are in-betweeners, I guess, so you'll pretty much see those whatever your schedule is, but generally you will not be hopping around from closing to opening shifts just all the time. But usually you do work the closing shifts on the program just in general, but I think especially at the resorts. I have heard people that only work the morning shifts, but that's pretty rare. My quick service shifts tended to be 5:30 to 11 p.m., or 5:30 to 11:30 p.m. was the most prominent one for all of us college programmers. 3 to 10 p.m., that was another big one. 4 to 10 p.m. Occasional, like 10:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. or 6:30. Those were kind of the midday shifts. But typically closing until the last couple months of my program. I know a long time ago, me and Blaze talked about how it's not like something that's explicitly stated, but a lot of the times there's kind of a hierarchy between people who were on the program who got there further back, and then the new programmers kind of take over the real closing positions. So the last couple months of my program, I actually didn't close very much. I usually got out at like 10 p.m., which was technically a non-closing shift. Bell Services was a completely different world. It was always 8-hour shifts, 3:30 p.m. to 12 a.m. That was a big one. 3:45 to 12:15. Those were the two closing shifts. 1 to 9:30 p.m. was another big one. And quick service is weird because a lot of the times you'll clock in and hit get assignment and it'll tell you where to go. Bell Services, you knew where to go based off of what time you clocked in, because there were only a few of us there at a time. So that 1 to 9:30, you were in a different room from everyone else, and you were basically just by yourself the whole time, which kind of sucked, but some people might like that. You had a computer, though, so couldn't do too much ridiculous stuff on it, but you could do some. And my favorite was the 11 a.m. to 7:30 p.m., which was the transfer shift. And that's when I got to take luggage from Coronado to the other resorts. Moving on to the parks here, morning shifts typically start at 9 a.m. when the park officially opens. Some locations and people will need to be there before that for early park entry. That can vary widely by role and location. For example, in attractions, the opening shifts started at 6 or 7 a.m. because you literally had to perform like a pre-opening ride checklist and quite literally start up the attraction. Those shifts were pretty much entirely done by full or part-timers, though. I don't know of any college programmers who became openers. You were trained for it for literally one day, but I think they expected you to have a little bit more experience there before you actually did that stuff. And the people who bid for their shifts, the full-timers, just bid for those shifts anyway, so college programmers probably weren't going to get them. Most closing shifts end around 9 to 10 p.m. Of course, park closing. Magic Kingdom does have later hours, though. Sometimes it could be 11 p.m., even 12 a.m. Closing time for some roles and locations, depending on the park hours. My typical shifts and attractions were 1 to 9:30 p.m. And a lot of the times, well, I say a lot of the times, probably once a week I would get a 12-hour 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. shift. Now, there are caveats to this. Magic Kingdom, special events can change that up big time. Halloween and Christmas parties may require you to work there well after midnight. I know Blaze, who worked quick service in Magic Kingdom, he sometimes would not get back to housing until 2 or 3 a.m. on those party nights. Hollywood Studios as well would sometimes host private events where people could rent out the park, usually corporations, and those would be later nights as well, because Toy Story Mania was one of the locations that stayed open for that. You'd have to stay a couple hours later on those nights, and it was weird because you wouldn't have your rotation. You just get put in a position and stay there all night. And one night I got put outside, not outside the entrance of the attraction, but just outside where people would walk into the building after they were in the queue, and sometimes you wouldn't see anyone for like 5 to 10 minutes. So that was a fun night, just standing out there. But despite having to work 6 days a week in attractions, I still believe parks have the edge on resorts in terms of the shifts you will work, the hours you will work. And as far as my experience, that was back when the program first opened back up from COVID. I believe they were having some staffing problems that led to us having to work more hours. I don't think that as many people are working 6 days a week now. It felt like everyone on the program was back then. But at the same time, that has always been a part of the program. Occasionally, you would have 6-day weeks, you would work, 10, I think the most I ever did was 13 days in a row or 12 days in a row. But normally it seems a little bit more leveled out now. But yeah, generally the parks have the edge when it comes to hours. You're not going to be there till midnight, usually, and you're not going to have to get up at 5 a.m. Now, as far as my final thoughts, a discussion of which I think you should prefer on your application, or just in general, what you should be looking forward to. Maybe it's kind of a cop-out answer, but I do not think there's a one-size-fits-all answer for this. Some people are going to want the hustle and bustle of the parks. Shifts go by a lot faster. I will tell you, a 12-hour shift in attractions felt as short, if not shorter, than an 8-hour shift in Bell Services. It flies by. If you're in the parks, you get to see a lot more cool stuff. Not to say you're not going to get to see anything, backstage at the resorts, but at the parks, you will see stuff that you will remember forever. Like, I was here, this was a piece of history that I got to see. And I've been backstage at a lot of the resorts on Bell Services, and like I said, it is kind of cool to be back there, but the parks have a lot more prestige in that regard. The resorts, I think if you're someone who is pursuing hospitality like I was, I wanted to be at a resort. I liked the whole hotel resort aspect. I frankly wanted it to be a little bit more laid back. The resorts will be good for you in that scenario, but like I said, after working quick service and then attractions, going to Bell Services, there were some days, quite a few, where I would be like, can something just happen? Like, please, something crazy, because this is just so unbelievably slow. And I really think in those fast-paced environments, like quick service, even though it was at a resort, attractions, I think you do build a deeper bond with your fellow cast members, fellow college programmers, in a fast-paced environment like that. So that's kind of another thing to keep in mind. But no, I think either way, it'll be a good experience. Like I said, there are pretty big differences between the parks and resorts in some ways, but also in other ways, you're still a Disney cast member. It all ties together. But yeah, I think it really just comes down to you personally. What are you doing the program for? Are you doing it for the prestige of working there? You want to see the cool backstage stuff? Are you just more doing it for career advancement? Well, that's not really a good way to put it, but just if hospitality is your fascination and you really want to work at like a 5-star hotel, put the resorts on there. Otherwise, put the parks, just put whatever you feel like is going to work for you. If you prefer the fast pace, if you prefer a slower pace, just do what you think will work for you. You may not get placed in what you want, but like I said, I think they do try to honor that. But either way, if you get accepted or if you're currently waiting to start the program, congratulations, and I will see you in the next video.